Chapter 12, Assessment of Aptitude. So, in comparison to achievement tests that we talked about in the previous chapter, in this chapter we are talking about aptitude tests. And aptitude tests are really about acquired ability to be good at something. And some of these are more general, and some of these assessments that we'll talk about are much more specific to a certain area or a certain task. But aptitude is not the same as ability level or proficiency in something. That is more what achievement tests look at. Aptitude is about predicting future success. It's about your potential to be able to do something. So the whole point of aptitude tests is to predict how well someone's going to do things in the future, how well someone's going to do in a certain environment, how well someone's going to do in a certain career perhaps. So it's very oriented towards the future, and it's oriented towards potential, right? So there are a couple of different types of aptitude tests that we are going to take a look at. We'll look at multiple aptitude test batteries, specialized aptitude tests, admissions-related tests, and then readiness tests. So here there are just some examples, and this is something pulled from your textbook, of different areas that are explored by different types of multiple aptitude batteries. And again, a battery is many different assessments put together to make one complete picture of something. So in this case, there are many different tests of ability that are put together to be able to show your potential in certain areas. So here we have the ASVAB, which we'll talk about in just a moment, that's used for military admissions and aptitude. The differential aptitude test, the general aptitude test battery, and the career ability placement survey. So these are some of the more widely used aptitude batteries, and you can see how some of them look at similar types of information, and some of them look at much more specific and specialized things like manual dexterity or mechanical reasoning, or looking at finger dexterity, which is a pretty specific thing to be looking at. So, and when you're looking at choosing one of these assessments, which are typically chosen by an employer or by an agency or the military or whomever's trying to assess the level of aptitude someone has, they would look at what types of areas of expertise they would want that person to be able to develop as part of that agency or employer or military branch or what have you. And then they would choose the correct battery that would go along with the types of information they're looking to collect. And this, in theory, would connect with the type of skills or training that they would need to get once they were enlisted in that branch or involved with that employer or in that university or what have you. So the first aptitude test we are going to explore is the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, or ASVAB. This is a norm-referenced test. A lot of aptitude tests are going to be norm-referenced. So this is an example of a battery that is norm-referenced. And this has been around for quite a while, since the late 60s. Part of something we'll talk about in the career class, which is the development of a lot of career assessments and vocational theories, came as veterans were coming back to the United States and needed some help with figuring out what to do next. So a lot of placement. So the ASVAB kind of came out of that type of movement. So it's generally used for assessing academic areas and career-related areas that would connect with military work. So this is used as an entrance exam for placement for different job assignments in different branches, and also certain ASVAB scores will help you qualify for enlistment bonuses depending on which branch and job assignment that you might qualify for from your scores. There is also a version of this assessment that can be used by civilians for career exploration. So this is used sometimes in schools. So it's the the ASVAB Career Exploration Program specifically, which is meant to explore all different kinds of careers and not just necessarily related to military placement. But the core purpose of the ASVAB battery and its development was to be an entrance exam for different military branches. So one of the biggest things on this exam is the military entrance score, your AFQT, and this is based on percentile rankings and summary scores that would qualify you for different job assignments in different military branches. Overall, the ASVAB is used quite a lot, thousands and thousands of people, and so in different iterations and development of the ASVAB, as so many people have been taking it, they've been able to really work on refining some of the reliability and validity of this assessment. So it's generally considered to be a pretty reliable aptitude test in terms of what it measures in both academic and career skill potential. So you'll see there those reliability coefficients, 0.88 and 0.91, which are pretty good because the closer we get to 1, the better the reliability is, if you remember from our previous chapter. And then 0.69 to 0.88. And so some types of internal inconsistency you're not going to get as close to 1 as you'll recall, because it's very difficult to be able to have that much in terms of internal reliability, but it's considered to be pretty respectable to have something within that range. So there are some more specialized aptitude tests that look at potential in very specific areas related to different careers or different areas of expertise. So for example, there are clerical aptitude tests, which look at your potential to perform typical office or clerical duties. So things like filing, keyboarding, coding, calculating, those kinds of things. Then there are ones that focus on mechanical abilities. So there are some different assessments that look at your capacity to learn about different mechanical objects, so different kinds of tools, ability to use the right tools to perform repairs, spatial reasoning, those kinds of things. So then there is psychomotor, so your ability to perform and use fine motor skills, which is a little different than mechanical, because mechanical ability is more about how to operate and use physical tools. Psychomotor is more about actually using your hands or your fingers to perform certain tasks. So less about which tool is the right one to use and more about using your tactile ability to do things. So a great example of this is that pegboard test that we watched the video of in our class that's linked on our class page. So the ability to do tactile things with your fingers in a certain amount of time. Artistic abilities, so there are some aptitude tests that look at your ability to draw or paint or even interpret and appreciate types of art. And then there's musical ability tests, so looking at your potential for ability to discriminate pitch, understand tempo, and understand sort of the mechanics of musical ability. So again, all of these are not about current skill level, but about potential for your ability to develop these skills in the future. So then there are admissions tests, and when we think about aptitude tests, these are usually the tests that come to mind first. So these are tests that are used to predict how well someone will perform in an educational program or in a school, and they're usually used as part of admissions materials in addition to transcripts, maybe writing samples, letters of recommendation, other evidence, because again, in looking at assessments, you would look at more than one source of information to make decisions about things. So aptitude tests would be one piece of the puzzle, in addition to looking at other information that you would gather to make an admissions decision. But usually these include some combination of verbal skills, quantitative mathematical skills, writing skills, analytical reasoning skills, And then there are all kinds of options that are related specifically to different subject areas or disciplines. So we will take a look at the SAT and PSAT, the GRE exam, and the MAT exam. The Scholastic Aptitude Test, or Scholastic Achievement Test. So they do have two tests that they are able to offer, one being more aptitude focused and one being more achievement focused. But these are pretty widely used by the College Board for college admissions. So they're pretty standard for almost every college and university in the United States. It's kind of the gold standard of admissions testing. And it's a little bit different now than when perhaps you and I took this test many moons ago. So now the SAT has scores that range from 200 to 800. The mean is 500 and a typical standard deviation is about 100. So again, your mean, your norm comparisons, you get percentile ranking based on other people who have taken the test. And so you see how well you did in comparison to others in that group normed test. So in terms of how well this actually predicts what you're going to do in college, there isn't necessarily a great correlation between grade point average in college and your SAT scores, but it's a really well marketed assessment and it's used pretty widely, and so there's not necessarily a way to get around having to take it, despite the fact that there's not a great statistical evidence to show that it is an actual good predictor of how well you're going to do in school. So there are two different parts of the test. There's the reasoning test and then the subject area tests, which are oftentimes optional depending on what your school is requiring of you or your program is requiring of you that you want to apply for in your major. So the typical reasoning test includes these different elements, so the critical reading, the math, the writing, and then there's the experimental section. So this is often how these aptitude tests continue to develop their validity and reliability information by including these experimental questions. So these questions don't actually count. They're used to develop future test questions, and then they take the outcomes of people who've taken those experimental questions and use them to determine the validity and reliability of certain items, that internal validity piece. And then if the validity is good enough, then they actually include it on future iterations of the test. If it's not, then they scrap the question. The tricky thing is you don't really know which ones are the experimental questions and which ones are the real questions. So it's kind of an irritating thing as a test taker, but a kind of important thing in test development to be able to continue to develop that validity and internal consistency of future questions. So as you can see, it's quite a lengthy test for someone to have to take, and often kids take it more than once. You also have the PSAT, which is what you would use to prepare for the SAT. And this also is what's used as the entry exam for the National Merit Scholarship programs. So they typically would use your PSAT scores that you would take prior to the actual SAT as an entrance exam for that purpose, and then a lot of students and schools use them as benchmarks to help kids get ready for college. So the Graduate Record Exam, or the GRE, may be a test that some of you have gotten to experience, and maybe not because it's not a program requirement for our program. But this is the same idea as the SAT, but for graduate school. So there are, again, the general tests and then the subject-specific tests. So depending on what field you're going into, you may have to take a subject-specific test. And most individuals take this on the computer nowadays. They do still have a paper test available, but most of the time you'll find it in a computerized format. And it's a bit different because it's an adaptive test. And adaptive tests are programmed on the computer with an algorithm. And so as it gives you questions, if you get that question right, it then gives you a harder question. If you get that question wrong, it gives you an easier question. And it keeps going until it's kind of honed in on your score. So it's kind of figured out the most difficult questions that you're able to master. And then the test cuts off and it gives you your score. So you may take it, you may have more questions or less questions depending on how long it takes for that adaptive test to hone in on your score. This is kind of a newer method of testing that some different achievement and aptitude tests are starting to use, which is supposed to be a better predictor of how well you'll do and more accurate in terms of identifying your true score and ability level in achievement tests. So as you can imagine, the subject-specific tests statistically are better predictors of your GPA in your first year of your graduate program than the general test is, because as you can imagine, this makes sense. So if you're going to go into counseling, for example, measuring like your math and verbal and writing skills may or may not strongly correlate with your ability to do basic counseling skills. If you're going into a PhD program, however, writing is a pretty important piece of things. So more writing specific pieces may be better predictors of how well you'll do in school as opposed to some other disciplines. So those subject tests, which are more specific to the field that you're in, are obviously going to be much better predictors of how you'll do in coursework that's related to that field in your first year of graduate school. But overall, again, partially because of the introduction of that adaptive test piece, the reliability is actually pretty good for both the GRE general test and subject tests in terms of outcomes. Then we have the Miller analogy test. So this is an alternative which is used for applying to graduate school. So some more engineering focused degrees, and some other schools require the MAT instead of a GRE. So this test is group administered. It's kind of interesting because it's given either verbally or on the computer, but most of the time it's on the computer. And it's fully focused on analogies. So the entire test is analogies. And it pulls from subject areas like literature, social science, chemistry, physics, math, and just general information. So it's a bit of a different test, and it's used for entrance into a lot of the high IQ societies that exist in the United States. So for example, Mensa uses this as an entry test for their society. So you have to get a 95th percentile score on the MAT in order to qualify for admission into the Mensa Society. So in addition to this test, in terms of looking at graduate school entrance exams, we do of course have the MCAT, Medical College Admissions Test for medical school, the LSAT, which is the law school admissions test, obviously for law school, and the GMAT, Graduate Management Admissions Test, which is used for a lot of like MBA or business-related graduate programs. Finally, we have readiness tests. So these are used for kids. So it's not just teenagers, young adults, and graduate students taking these aptitude tests. We've got little kids taking them too. So this test is used to determine readiness to start kindergarten or first grade. And so this has a couple of different components that are meant to determine potential for success in school. So there's the physical aspect, which has to do with like sensory motor skills, and growth and general well-being and health. There's social emotional, so social skills, psychological well-being, interpersonal interactions with others, self-regulation skills, the capacity for learning, which includes attention, curiosity, excitement about being in school, language, which is verbal communication, typically in English. So this is usually an English language focused test, so bear that in mind when we're thinking about things like cultural considerations. So looking at both verbal and nonverbal communication, and then any kind of early literacy. So as you can imagine, if English is your second language, this might be quite challenging for you. Cognition and general knowledge then looks at problem-solving skills, abstract reasoning potential, math skills, and again, we're looking at like 5-year-olds in all of these areas. So there's some mixed research about how reliable these assessments really are in predicting how well kids are going to do in school. And you can imagine why. Because when you're young, everybody has a bit of a different developmental process. Everyone has unique circumstances, and kids just sort of grow at their own pace. And so to try to create an aptitude test that's going to predict how well a kid's going to grow and learn through such an early developmental stage of their life is incredibly difficult to capture on a standardized assessment, as you can imagine.